What if I told you that the leader of one of Brazil's most notorious outlaw gangs wasn't just ruthless, he was calculated, cunning, and far more brutal than anything you could imagine? In the shadows of Brazil's history lies a figure whose name sends chills down the spines of those who dared cross him. But unlike most outlaw legends, what this man did to those within his own gang's most trusted followers was far worse than what any lawman could ever do. This man, known to his enemies and followers alike as Brazil SC, Outlaw Kingi, wasn't content with simply ruling his gang with terror. No, his punishment for betrayal wasn't death, it was something far darker, more twisted, and something that left no chance of survival, not just for the body, but for the very soul. You see, the myth of the Outlaw King is one of betrayal, loyalty, and violence. But it's also about how far one man would go to keep his power intact. While others were content to kill off traitors, this king had a way of breaking his men not with a sword, but with their minds. The terrifying reality is that betrayal wasn't simply punished. It was annihilated, erased from history in the most gruesome way imaginable. But what exactly made him so feared? Was it his ability to conquer territory? Or was it his skill in turning his own gang members against one another? The truth is darker, more psychological. You see, the Outlaw King understood something that many leaders never did. To control a gang, you don't just need to strike fear into their hearts. You need to make them fear the very idea of betrayal, even more than death itself. The rules were simple but terrifyingly effective. If you betrayed the Outlaw King, you didn't just face death. You faced an unimaginable fate, one that left scars deeper than any wound, scars that would haunt you forever. And the worst part? You had no choice but to comply. Once you entered his world, there was no escaping his control, no way out. The price of betrayal wasn't just death, it was a fate that left the mind shattered, broken beyond repair. Stay with me, because what you'll learn about this man and what he did to those who crossed him might surprise you. It's not the story of a king who ruled with brute force. It's the story of a man who ruled with terror, with manipulation, and with a dark, twisted sense of justice. Have you ever wondered what would make someone so ruthless that they'd go to such extremes? Well, get ready, because we're about to uncover the hidden truths of the Outlaw King's reign. His story is one of betrayal, punishment, and violence, but it's also one that reveals something chilling about human nature. If you're ready to dive deeper into the twisted world of Brazil's Outlaw King, make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in their shoes? Like this video if you're intrigued by what's to come, and don't forget to check if you're subscribed so you won't miss the shocking truths we're about to uncover. Keep watching, because what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and betrayal. Before he became Brazil's feared Outlaw King, he was just a unremarkable boy born into a world where survival was the only law. His story didn't begin with an army or riches. It didn't start in a palace or a royal court. Instead, it started in the dirt, in the struggles of a life marked by poverty, rejection, and violence. He was a product of the harsh Brazilian countryside, where only the strong survive, and even they could be betrayed by their own. He wasn't born into a noble family or trained in the art of war from childhood. No, his rise was different. It was forged in the fire of necessity. From the moment he could walk, he learned that loyalty was a currency far more valuable than gold, and betrayal an unforgivable sin. But for him, there were no alliances to be made with kings or generals. His first alliances were forged in the shadows, among thieves, outcasts, and men who knew how to survive when everything else failed. The Outlaw King's early years weren't spent in grand halls, but in the alleys and forests of Brazil's most remote regions. His youth was filled with desperate decisions that would soon shape the kind of leader he would become. Like many outlaws, his rise wasn't about conquest or battle. It was about control. It was about mastering the art of survival when society itself had turned its back on you. At a young age, he learned to wield a weapon not out of desire for power, but out of necessity. His skills weren't honed in training or under the guidance of a mentor. Instead, they were sharpened through years of surviving bandit raids, evading capture, and learning how to navigate the complex webs of alliances and betrayals that defined the outlaw world. The world he lived in was unforgiving, and in it, a person either rose to the top or was crushed beneath it. But the Outlaw King wasn't content to simply survive. He wasn't just a pawn in a world full of criminals and thieves. He had bigger ambitions. As he grew older, the very same ruthless instincts that kept him alive began to turn into a thirst for power. He wasn't just going to be another bandit in the hills, he was going to build an empire of his own, one where he would control everything, from the loyalty of his followers to the lives of those who dared cross him. His first steps toward power were small, almost imperceptible. At first, he gathered a few loyal men, outcasts like himself, who shared his desire for something more than just survival. They weren't an army, they were a brotherhood, bound by the understanding that in a world filled with violence, the only way to thrive was to control it. They began robbing, raiding, and taking what they needed, and in the process, the Outlaw King proved himself as more than just a leader. He was a master strategist with a mind as sharp as a blade he carried. As his gang grew, so did his reputation. The Outlaw King wasn't just a man of violence, he was a man of strategy. He knew how to play the game of power like no one else. He made alliances with other bandits, using promises of riches and safety as leverage. But unlike other leaders, he didn't just rely on the strength of his men. He understood the importance of loyalty, and he demanded it. He became a figure people feared not just for his ability to fight, but for his ability to manipulate and control everyone around him. Through it all, he maintained a singular vision to build an empire, one that would be untouchable, where betrayal would have no place and loyalty would be absolute. He didn't just want to lead, he wanted to dominate. And as he rose through the ranks, he found that the price of loyalty was often betrayal from the very men who swore to stand by him. But the Outlaw King didn't just crush his enemies with violence. He understood something far more chilling. Power wasn't about brute force alone. It was about fear. And the best way to keep men in line was to make them fear the consequences of betrayal more than they feared death itself. That was the real power. He sought the power to break a man's will and make him loyal, not just out of fear of punishment, but out of respect for the strength and cunning of his leader. And so, from humble beginnings, the Outlaw King grew into a man of terrifying power. His gang became more than just a group of outcasts. They became a well-oiled machine, moving swiftly and ruthlessly through the Brazilian landscape. The loyalty of his followers was unquestionable, but the cost of that loyalty, well, that's a story we'll explore next. If you think you've got a sense of how this story will unfold, stay with me, because what you're about to discover about the Outlaw King's rule will send chills down your spine. It wasn't long before the Outlaw King's empire was put to the ultimate test. Power, as he learned early on, wasn't just about controlling your followers, it was about making sure they never even considered turning against you. The first time his loyalty was tested wasn't in the form of an enemy outside his gang, but from within it. A traitor in his ranks. This wasn't some random act of disobedience, it was a betrayal that struck at the very core of the Outlaw King's leadership. One of his most trusted men, someone who had been by his side since the beginning, had secretly started making deals with rival gangs, exchanging information for protection, all while pretending to serve the Outlaw King. It wasn't just about stealing from him, it was about undermining everything the Outlaw King had worked to build. But what made this betrayal even more dangerous was the trust that had been placed in this man. He wasn't just any follower, he was a confidant, someone who had shared countless plans and secrets with the Outlaw King. This wasn't just a betrayal of business, it was a personal betrayal. The Outlaw King had trusted him, and that trust had been shattered. In many ways, this was the moment that defined the Outlaw King's rule. It was no longer just about power, it was about control. And the first test of control was brutal, swift, and, as we would come to see, far worse than anyone could have imagined. The Outlaw King didn't just seek to punish betrayal, he wanted to send a message. He wanted everyone in his gang to understand one thing. Loyalty was not just expected, it was demanded. The punishment for betrayal was severe, but it was not immediately obvious what it would be. The Outlaw King didn't rely on brute force alone. He was a master manipulator, and in this case, he chose a form of punishment that would break the spirit of anyone who even thought about betraying him. This man, his once trusted follower, was brought before the Outlaw King, bound and kneeling on the cold ground. The Outlaw King looked at him not with rage, but with cold calculation. Betrayal was not something to be dealt with hastily. No, he needed to make an example of this man. The punishment wasn't a simple execution. That would have been too easy. The Outlaw King had something far more excruciating planned. The first step was isolation. The traitor was taken far from the gang to a desolate place in the wilderness, away from the eyes of his former comrades. Here, the Outlaw King didn't need to do anything physically, he just let the elements do their work. It was here that the real horror of the punishment began. The traitor was left to face the wilderness alone, with nothing but his own thoughts to accompany him. But the Outlaw King knew that isolation alone wouldn't break him. No, the real punishment came from knowing that every single person in the gang would know what had happened to him. Word spread quickly. The traitor would never be able to show his face again, not among the Outlaw King's men. Every whisper in the wind, every shadow in the forest would remind him that he was the man who betrayed the king. The punishment was psychological, far more than physical. The Outlaw King didn't need to break his body, he needed to break his spirit, to show that there was no escape, no way to hide. The fear of betrayal was far more terrifying than the pain of death. Every man in the gang saw what happened to the traitor, and in that moment, they understood that loyalty wasn't just an expectation, it was a matter of survival. But the Outlaw King wasn't done yet. He made sure that every member of his gang knew that, no matter how close they were, no matter how much trust they'd earned, their loyalty would always be tested. This man's punishment was a warning, but it wasn't just for the traitor. It was for everyone who thought they could escape his rule. When the traitor was finally brought back, broken not by wounds but by the weight of his guilt and fear, the Outlaw King didn't give him a quick death. No, the punishment had already been delivered. The man had been broken, not by physical force, but by the sheer power of the Outlaw King's control over his mind. The message was clear. No one was above the Outlaw King. No one could afford to betray him. The punishment would be far worse than death. It would be a life lived in fear, in isolation, in the knowledge that loyalty was everything. And betrayal was the worst sin imaginable. When the Outlaw King first rose to power, he knew that loyalty would be the cornerstone of his rule. But loyalty in a world ruled by betrayal and violence wasn't easily earned. It had to be relentlessly maintained. And the price of betrayal, it would not be paid in the same coin as any other leader's punishment. No quick death, no honor in dying for disobedience. The Outlaw King had a far worse fate in store for anyone who crossed him, a punishment so severe it shattered not only the body but the very soul. For his followers, this wasn't just a leader, was a force of nature, an embodiment of the laws of survival in the most unforgiving environment. But with the loyalty came the inevitable test. If you were to betray him, would you survive the punishment, or would you become a cautionary tale that others would whisper about in fear? The answer, as many soon found out, was simple. The price of betrayal was a fate worse than death itself. This is where the Outlaw King's genius lay. He didn't kill traitors outright. To do so would have been merciful. And mercy, for him, was something far below the threshold of justice. Instead, he devised a punishment that left the traitor breathing, walking, but hollow. The concept of death didn't even enter the equation. For the Outlaw King, death was a release. What he wanted was something far worse. He wanted to watch his enemies suffer, not for a brief moment, but for a lifetime. The first of these punishments, a technique the Outlaw King perfected over time, was psychological torture. The traitors didn't just face isolation, they faced the utter destruction of their identities. The first step in this was exile, but it wasn't exile to some far-off land or jungle. it was exiled to a mental prison. The victim was taken away from the rest of the gang, stripped of any contact with their old life, and locked into an environment where everything they once held dear, friendship, loyalty, the very concept of belonging, was gone. This wasn't a prison of stone walls. No, it was worse. It was a prison of the mind. The traitor was left alone, with only their thoughts to keep them company. The silence was deafening. The Outlaw King knew that a man could go insane without physical torture. He understood that when someone's world is stripped away, their mind is the last fortress. And to break that, you had to make them feel the weight of their own decisions. But that wasn't enough. To truly break a man, to ensure he never considered turning against the Outlaw King again, the punishment would escalate. After days, or even weeks, of isolation, the traitor would be brought back. But not as a man. They would return as a shadow of their former self, broken and humiliated. This wasn't about death, it was about erasure. The Outlaw King understood that a man could always die with dignity. But erasing him, breaking his spirit, that was where true punishment lay. The second phase of the punishment came when the traitor was brought back before the gang. There, they weren't executed. They weren't even killed in battle. Instead, they were paraded in front of the others alive, but utterly humiliated. They would have to stand there, head bowed, as the others whispered and pointed. The Outlaw King would look into their eyes and see nothing but fear and shame. This public humiliation, this rejection of everything they had once been, was designed to strip the traitor of their humanity. But even that wasn't enough for the Outlaw King. The final step was to make sure the traitor never left, never escaped. The prison they had created, he would send them on missions, insignificant menial tasks that they would be forced to carry out alone. They would be isolated once again, but this time not in physical solitude. The cruelest way possible, they would be alone in the eyes of the gang. The worst kind of isolation was being among others, but still knowing that you were completely and utterly alone. These men were given the chance to redeem themselves, but redemption was a farce. The Outlaw King knew that a man who had betrayed his comrades could never be trusted again. No amount of work, no number of tasks could erase what had been done. It wasn't just the fear of death that kept the traitors in line. It was the knowledge that, no matter how much they tried to prove their loyalty, they would always be remembered as the ones who had fallen. And so, the Outlaw King's punishment was not about taking a life. It was about ensuring that those who betrayed him would never feel whole again. It was about making sure that the consequences of betrayal would haunt them every moment they remained alive. The mental torture, the public disgrace, and the endless tasks were his way of ensuring that his power remained unquestioned. His gang was united not by fear of death, but by fear of losing everything they had: loyalty, friendship, and identity. Now think about it. What could be worse than knowing you would never be able to live in peace again? What could be more terrifying than a life where every step was a reminder of your betrayal? The Outlaw King's genius wasn't in his ability to kill, it was in his ability to make people wish they had died. Fear. It's a word we often associate with weakness, but in the world of the Outlaw King, fear wasn't just a talent, was the foundation of his power. To truly understand how he maintained such absolute control over his gang, we need to dive deep into the psychology of fear and its role in his reign. Fear, for him, was not simply about intimidation. It was about creating a world where his followers didn't just fear the consequences of disobedience, they feared the consequences of not obeying. The Outlaw King wasn't a brute who relied solely on physical strength to enforce his rule. No, he was a master of psychological manipulation. His real weapon was the threat of an unthinkable punishment, something so extreme, so horrifying that no one could ever risk defying him. And the best part, he didn't need to carry out the punishment every time. The mere possibility of it was enough to keep his gang in line. Think about it. How do you control a group of dangerous, battle-hardened criminals? You don't just command them with force. You need to instill in them the certainty that betrayal, even the thought of it, will lead to a fate so terrible that it becomes unimaginable. This is where the Outlaw King's genius lay. He didn't need to execute every traitor. What he needed was to make the very idea of betrayal feel like the worst thing that could happen. The Outlaw King understood something that most leaders never grasp. Fear isn't just about punishing the enemy, it's about making your followers fear themselves. He didn't just want his men to fear him. He wanted them to fear what would happen to them if they crossed him. And the beauty of this strategy, it's not about violence. It's about the threat of violence. It's about controlling the narrative, making sure that every man in his gang knew exactly what awaited them if they even thought about stepping out of line. Every time one of his men saw a traitor punished, the fear grew. Every whisper of disobedience was met with a chilling reminder of what could happen. And this wasn't just about a fear of death, it was a fear of obliteration. The Outlaw King wasn't just punishing men, he was erasing them, stripping away their very identity. The worst fate, the one most of his men feared above all else, wasn't death. It was becoming nothing. Hollow shell of a person, stripped of their dignity, their status, and their place in the gang. The fear didn't stop there. It seeped into every interaction. Every time a follower looked into the Outlaw King's eyes, they knew that beneath the surface, a tempest of wrath could be unleashed at any moment. It was never about being a constant presence of fear. It was about creating an atmosphere where no one could ever feel truly safe, no matter how long they'd been loyal. Because loyalty in the world of the Outlaw King wasn't just a choice, it was a requirement that was constantly tested. And the punishment for failing that test was the scariest thing imaginable. But what's even more terrifying is how the Outlaw King used this fear to manipulate the very concept of loyalty. By creating a world where betrayal was so severely punished, he ensured that his men would never question his authority. But it wasn't just about keeping them in line, it was about ensuring they would want to stay loyal. Because loyalty wasn't just about fear of punishment. It was about the fear of losing everything they had worked for, everything they had built in his gang. His ability to make loyalty seem like the only option was a key factor in maintaining control. And this, in turn, created a sense of unity among his followers. But it was a unity built on fear, not camaraderie. The Outlaw King didn't unite his gang through shared values or friendship. He united them through shared fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of punishment, and fear of losing everything they had. And here's where the psychology of fear becomes even more fascinating. The Outlaw King knew that fear isn't just about punishment, it's about the constant, looming threat of what could happen if things go wrong, the uncertainty of what could await you if you cross the line. And this uncertainty is what made the fear so effective. It wasn't about knowing the punishment, it was about not knowing what could happen next. The unpredictability made it all the more terrifying. This created a system where every member of the gang was constantly on edge, always looking over their shoulder, never truly sure if they were doing enough to earn the Outlaw King's trust. This uncertainty, this constant tension, was the glue that held the gang together. It kept them loyal, not out of love or respect, but out of sheer survival instinct. The Outlaw King didn't need to be omnipresent to maintain his rule. He just needed to create a world where fear, not respect, was the strongest bond among his followers. And as long as that fear was in place, no one would dare betray him. No one would dare question his authority, because in his world, the consequences of disobedience were too terrifying to even imagine. The Outlaw King wasn't just a leader, he was a master of psychological warfare. His understanding of the human mind and how fear could be weaponized made him far more dangerous than any brute force could. Unlike many who relied on strength or violence to maintain control, the Outlaw King knew that breaking a person's will was far more effective than breaking their body. The real battle wasn't physical, it was mental, and the Outlaw King's genius was in his ability to manipulate and control the minds of his enemies before they even knew what was happening. His methods were subtle, calculated, and, above all, devastating. The first step in his psychological warfare was always to isolate his enemies, who were members of rival gangs or disloyal followers within his own ranks. The Outlaw King knew that once you separate a person from their support system, you begin to chip away at their resolve. Isolation creates doubt, confusion, and fear the perfect environment for breaking someone's will. It wasn't enough to simply threaten someone. The Outlaw King understood that fear could be manipulated and heightened in a way that left his enemies mentally exposed. Take, for example, the infamous method he used on anyone who posed a threat to his rule. He didn't just deal with them physically. He made sure they lived with the terror of never knowing when their punishment would come. The process began with seemingly innocuous gestures, small, calculated moves that appeared harmless at first. But over Chimi, these moves built up to something far more insidious. The Outlaw King's followers would begin to notice strange patterns. One day, an ally would be removed from the group with no explanation. The next day, another would disappear. These weren't just acts of violence, they were acts of psychological manipulation. The constant fear of the unknown, the uncertainty of who would be next, gnawed away at the minds of his enemies. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living in a perpetual state of fear, where even the most loyal followers began to wonder if they were next in line. The Outlaw King didn't just break people physically, he broke their sense of security, their trust in everything and everyone around them. And once you destroy a person's trust, you have complete control over them. But it didn't stop there. The Outlaw King used what could be called reverse psychology on his enemies. He would make them believe they were making decisions of their own, only to later reveal that they had been manipulated into it. This tactic was most effective with his gang members, who believed that they had some measure of power or control over their fate. But in reality, every move they made was dictated by the Outlaw King's designs. He understood that the illusion of choice was more powerful than actual freedom, and he used this to his advantage. One of his most effective tools was the use of guilt. The Outlaw King knew how to exploit the moral compass of his followers. He would put them in situations where they had to make impossible choices that weighed heavily on their conscience. These decisions would often leave them feeling trapped and isolated, unable to go back to their previous lives. Once a man was psychologically cornered, it wasn't long before he would become compliant. And if he didn't, well, the consequences were devastating. The Outlaw King didn't just break the minds of his enemies, he made them break themselves. They would question their loyalties, their decisions, and their very sense of self. It wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a matter of preserving their identity. The fear of losing who they were, of becoming something they couldn't recognize, was often more terrifying than death itself. This psychological warfare was what set the Outlaw King apart from other leaders. While others might have used physical force to crush their enemies, he understood that a person could be brought to their knees long before a sword ever touched their skin. It was about taking away everything a person valued, their sense of security, their self-worth, and their trust in others. By doing this, the Outlaw King ensured that his enemies were broken, not just in body, but in spirit. As his reign continued, his methods became more refined. He would use the guilt of his followers to drive wedges between them, making them doubt their loyalty, not just to him, but to each other. He would turn friends into enemies, allies into rivals. The result was a gang that was constantly on edge, unable to trust anyone, even themselves. This environment created the perfect breeding ground for fear and control. And what's truly chilling is how successful this form of psychological warfare was. The Outlaw King didn't need to physically harm his enemies to destroy them. All he needed was to make them question their place in the world, their sense of self, and their connection to the people around them. Once their will was broken, they were no longer a threat. They were simply pawns in his game. As the Outlaw King's empire expanded, so did the number of enemies and rivals who sought to overthrow him. But the most chilling betrayal was not from an external force, it came from within his own ranks. This final betrayal would test the boundaries of his rule, pushing the Outlaw King to a point where the very foundation of his authority was challenged. And the response to this betrayal would reveal just how far he was willing to go to maintain his grip on power. The man who betrayed him was not just a follower, but one of the Outlaw King's closest confidants. He had been there since the beginning, sharing in the bloodshed, the victories, and the losses. But as the Outlaw King Essiompia grew, so did the whispers of power. His closest men started to feel the weight of their own ambitions. They started to question if they could rule as he did, or if they could take over his empire for themselves. What made this betrayal even more dangerous was that it was carefully planned. The traitor didn't just stab the outlaw king in the back in a moment of weakness. No, this betrayal was orchestrated over months, a slow burn that would destroy everything the outlaw king had built. And the worst part, the traitor had the support of others in the gang, a faction that was ready to seize power for themselves. But what the traitor didn't realize was that the outlaw king had already anticipated such a move. He wasn't a fool. He knew that power in the outlaw world was constantly shifting, and that betrayal was as much a part of the game as loyalty. So, when the moment finally arrived and the traitor made his move, the outlaw king was ready not to destroy him outright, but to make him wish he had never considered crossing him. The first step in the outlaw king's response was to let the traitor believe he had won. There was no immediate confrontation, no violent outburst. Instead, the outlaw king allowed the traitor to think he had succeeded. 4 days, the traitor moved freely, making plans, speaking to others, consolidating his power. He thought he had outsmarted the outlaw king. But in reality, he had walked straight into the trap the outlaw king had set for him. It wasn't long before the true extent of the betrayal was revealed to the rest of the gang. The outlaw king had made sure that the traitor's plans were exposed, not through brute force, but through manipulation. Slowly, he turned the gang against him, using whispers, rumors, and calculated moves to isolate the traitor from his allies. The very men who had once supported him were now beginning to doubt his loyalty, and soon the traitor found himself standing alone. But this was just the beginning. The outlaw king didn't just want to strip the traitor of his power, he wanted to break him. The punishment that followed was more than just physical. The outlaw king used his knowledge of fear and manipulation to ensure that the traitor would never regain the loyalty of the men he had once commanded. The traitor was publicly humiliated, forced to face his followers as the outlaw king laid bare every deceit, every secret betrayal, every promise broken. There was no mercy, no forgiveness. The final act of the outlaw king's response came when the traitor was stripped of everything: his power, his status, his respect. He was cast out, not just from the gang, but from the very world he had known. The punishment wasn't death, it was worse. The traitor was left to wander, alone, with no allies, no friends, and no place to call home. The outlaw king had erased him, not physically, but psychologically. In the end, the traitor was nothing more than a memory, a ghost of what had once been. This final betrayal showed just how far the outlaw king was willing to go to maintain control. His response wasn't about revenge, it was about sending a message that no one, no matter how close, could ever betray him without facing the most unimaginable consequences. The outlaw king's rule wasn't built on power or violence alone. It was built on the fear of losing everything, the fear of becoming nothing. And this betrayal, more than any other, proved that no one was safe from his wrath. The reign of the outlaw king has been shrouded in mystery, debated in the dark corners of history, and romanticized by countless legends. But the true legacy he left behind is not the one that has been told in popular stories. While many historians focus on his violence, his leadership, and his conquests, they overlook the more sinister aspects of his rule, the ones that have been buried, deliberately forgotten, or twisted to fit a more palatable narrative. At first glance, the outlaw king seems like the typical figure of a criminal mastermind, violent, and unstoppable. But when you dig deeper into the accounts of those who lived under his rule, you begin to see a different picture. The power he wielded wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and even spiritual. His reign wasn't just about controlling territory or amassing wealth, it was about completely dominating the lives of those around him, bending them to his will, and stripping them of their humanity. Historians who focus solely on his actions, his gangi wars, his violent retribution, his ruthless tacticness, the core of what made the outlaw king such a terrifying figure. His legacy was not just one of fear and violence, it was one of complete and utter control. His ability to manipulate the minds of his followers, his ability to turn loyalty into a prison, and his skill at using psychological warfare to break his enemies made him far more dangerous than any simple criminal leader. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his legacy is the way his methods continue to be echoed in the world today. The outlaw king didn't just rule through fear. He ruled through manipulation, through the breaking of wills, and through the exploitation of human weaknesses. And as time has passed, the lessons of his reign have been absorbed into the fabric of leadership and control in ways that are still present in society. It's not just criminals who used the outlaw king's tactics. His strategies have been applied in politics, business, and even in relationships. The ability to make people fear the consequences of betrayal, to control them through uncertainty and manipulation, to turn loyalty into a weapon. These are the dark tools of power that the outlaw king mastered. His legacy is one that is difficult to accept because it challenges the very nature of what we think leadership should be. When historians look back on his life, they often focus on the brutality of his reign, but what they fail to acknowledge is how he twisted loyalty itself into a weapon. He didn't just demand obedience, made his followers believe that their very survival depended on their loyalty. The fear of betrayal wasn't just a threat. It was the fabric of his empire. He turned fear into a currency, and the men who followed him were willing to pay any price to avoid the punishment that awaited those who crossed him. This twisted form of leadership created a legacy that extended far beyond his death. While the outlaw king may have passed from the world, the lessons he taught about control, fear, and loyalty are still present in the strategies of leaders who understand the power of psychological manipulation. In a way, his influence has outlived him, continuing to shape the way power is exerted over others. Even today, historians will tell you about the battles he won, the territories he claimed, and the brutality of his punishments. But they won't tell you about the psychological warfare he waged on his followers or how he turned trust and fear into tools for total control. They won't tell you about the hidden aspects of his reign, the parts of his story that have been deliberately erased. Because the truth is far too unsettling to confront. The outlaw king didn't just rule with violence, he ruled with the mind. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling part of his legacy. Because the outlaw king understood something that many rulers, even today, failed to grasp. To control a kingdom, you don't need an army. You need to control the minds of the people. Fear is just the beginning. What comes next is the complete and utter manipulation of every thought, every action, every loyalty, and that is a power that doesn't just disappear when the king dies. It endures, often in the shadows, quietly influencing the course of history. The outlaw king's rule was not just one of terror and violence. It was a masterclass in understanding the price of betrayal and the consequences that come with crossing those in power. His story, though dark and brutal, offers profound lessons on loyalty, power, and the human psyche. And while his actions were extreme, they shed light on the deeper, often unspoken dynamics of authority and trust. One of the most critical lessons from the outlaw king's reign is how the fear of betrayal can shape relationships and power structures. The king's brutal responses to betrayal were not just a matter of punishing those who crossed him. They were about ensuring that no one in his circle ever doubted the price of disloyalty. His punishment wasn't just about revenge, it was about maintaining absolute control, using betrayal as the ultimate tool to reinforce loyalty. The outlaw king didn't simply demand respect, he demanded fear, and with that fear, loyalty was sealed. In the world the outlaw king created, betrayal was not only a personal affront, it was a crime against the very foundation of the empire he had built. His response to betrayal of the psychological breakdown of his followers, the isolation, the mental torment was meant to drive home one simple truth. That betrayal would leave you broken, unrecognizable to those you once called allies. It wasn't just about breaking a man's body, it was about erasing his existence, stripping him of his place in the world. The lesson here is clear. Once loyalty is breached, there is no going back. The outlaw king knew this better than anyone. Loyalty, in his eyes, was sacred. And once someone betrayed him, there was no forgiveness. There was no redemption. The price of betrayal was permanent, irreversible, and painful. The worst part wasn't the punishment, it was the fact that the traitor would live with the weight of their decision for the rest of their life. No matter how many apologies they made, no matter how much they begged for mercy, the damage was done. Trust was shattered, and with it, their place in the gang, their status, and their identity. The Outlaw King's approach to betrayal also reveals a dark truth about human nature. Once someone has crossed a line, the perception of them changes forever. People will never see them the same way again. Even if they manage to return to the fold, they will always carry the mark of the traitor. This is why betrayal, in the world of the Outlaw King, was treated as the ultimate sin, one that could not be washed away with time, apologies, or guilt. The damage was done in the eyes of those who had once trusted the betrayer. But the lesson from the Outlaw King's reign goes beyond just the consequences of betrayal. It's about how power structures are built and maintained. The Outlaw King's ability to control his gang wasn't rooted solely in physical force or violence. It was rooted in his understanding of fear and loyalty. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted unquestioning loyalty. And the way to achieve that was to make sure that everyone understood the dire consequences of betraying the trust of the leader. What's particularly interesting about the Outlaw King system is how it mirrors power dynamics in other areas of life, whether it be in the workplace, in politics, or even in personal relationships. Loyalty, once tested, can never be fully restored. And in a world where power is often fragile, maintaining that loyalty becomes a cornerstone of control. The Outlaw King, in his own twisted way, understood this better than most. His ability to manipulate the emotions, fears, and minds of his followers ensured that they remained loyal not out of respect, but out of sheer fear of what would happen if they didn't. Another lesson to take away from his reign is how trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. This is a universal truth. Whether in a gang of outlaws or in the relationships we form in our personal lives, once trust is shattered, the foundation of that relationship is never the same. In the Outlaw King's world, betrayal wasn't just a betrayal of a literate, was a betrayal of a system, a community, a way of life. And no amount of remorse or apology could change that. In the end, the story of the Outlaw King is not just about one man's rise to power, but about the complex web of loyalty, trust, and betrayal that lies at the heart of every power structure. The price of betrayal is high, and the consequences are far. And as the Outlaw King's story shows us, once trust is broken, there's no going back. The Outlaw King may have lived and died long ago, but his actions still echo through history, resonating in the dark recesses of human nature. His reign, built on fear, loyalty, and brutality, offers a chilling glimpse into the mind of a leader who understood the power of manipulation better than most. But what is perhaps most unsettling is how his legacy continues to influence the way we view power, loyalty, and betrayal today. The Outlaw King didn't just create an empire of outlaws. He created a system of control that thrived on the psychological subjugation of his followers. His ability to dominate the minds of his gang members wasn't just about wielding physical power. It was about playing on their deepest fears, their insecurities, and their primal need for survival. In many ways, he understood something that modern leaders, whether in politics, business, or even personal relationships, still use to this day. The fear of betrayal is one of the most powerful tools a leader can wield. But what makes the Outlaw King's methods even more chilling is how they persist in today's world. The psychological warfare, the manipulation of loyalty, the use of fear to control these tactics are still employed by leaders who seek absolute control. Whether it's a CEO using fear to maintain power, a dictator exploiting loyalty to manipulate the or even individuals using emotional manipulation in personal relationships. These strategies employed by the Outlaw King continue to resonate, and this is where his legacy becomes truly disturbing. The Outlaw King didn't just leave behind a trail of violence and death. He left behind a blueprint for how to control and dominate people, not through physical might, but through the destruction of their will and the manipulation of their emotions. His legacy isn't just about the punishment of traitors, it's about the way power and control can be maintained through fear, through isolation, and through the destruction of trust. What the Outlaw King understood better than most was that once loyalty is compromised, once betrayal has taken place, there's no easy way back. People can forgive, they can move on, but the scars left by betrayal are permanent. And the Outlaw King made sure that his followers knew this. He made sure they understood that there was no second chance for betrayal. His rule wasn't just about survival. It was about ensuring that loyalty was so deeply ingrained that it became a matter of life and death. As you look back on the Outlaw King's legacy, it's hard not to draw parallels to the world we live in today. We live in a world where loyalty is tested daily, where power dynamics are shaped by manipulation and control, and where the fear of betrayal often governs our decisions. The Outlaw King may have been a figure of the past, but his methods and his legacy continue to shape how we view power and loyalty in the present. So, what does this mean for us today? Are we still living in the shadow of the Outlaw King's reign? Have his methods of psychological manipulation and control become so ingrained in our world that we don't even notice them anymore? The truth is unsettling. The Outlaw King's legacy is not just one of fear and violence, it's one of understanding the depths to which power can reach and how easily it can break us. If you've made it this far, you're beginning to see the true scope of his reign, not just as a criminal leader, but as a master of psychological warfare and manipulation. The lessons of the Outlaw King aren't just historical, they are relevant today, in every aspect of our lives, from our personal relationships to the systems of power that govern us. If you've been following this journey, you've seen how the Outlaw King's reign still resonates, how his tactics of control and fear echo through history, and how they continue to shape the way we live today. The question now is, what will we do with this knowledge? Will we continue to live under the influence of these dark truths, or will we recognize them and rise above them? As always, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into history's darkest figures. If you've made it to the end of this video, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the Outlaw King's legacy. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. And hit the like button if you found this journey into the past as gripping as I did. There's more to come, so stay tuned for the next video where we'll continue exploring the hidden corners of history.